My father was a master wood pattern maker, mainly in the auto industry in Cleveland. This means he would make machine parts in wood, later to be cast in metal. It was a highly technical job, one of the essential professions that excused men from military service in World War II. I was always interested to learn more about what my father did. When I moved to San Francisco, I became good friends with Peter Morenstein, the founder and owner of Searcast, a metal casting foundry specializing in fine art and historical restorational hardware. Peter responded to my questions about his work by inviting me to make a bunny. In other words, do a small metal casting project of my own. I think I surprised Peter with the scale of my project. I wanted to make a bell, fashioned after the Buddhist Temple bells. So I started with some library research, culminating at the Asian Art Museum. Casting is all about positives and negatives. Each method has its own inherent issues. Though my father's patterns were sand cast, I chose the lost wax method. First, I needed to create a positive wood pattern. For this, I laminated lumber, turned it on a lathe to its basic shape, sealed it, and painted it for easy mold release. I wrapped the wood pattern in 1 inch of clay and surrounded that with a plaster shell. I then split the shell open, removed the clay, and poured latex into the space between the wood and the plaster. This gives you an exact negative latex mold of the wood pattern. I then poured in wax and drained it from the mold repeatedly until it reached a desired thickness of 1 inch. Once the wax positive was cooled, removed from the latex mold, and cleaned, I could begin to apply the additional details, which were easier to add now at the wax stage rather than carving them in wood. Now that the wax positive was complete, I made a ceramic shell negative by dipping the wax pattern into a silicon slurry, then applying sand to it to gradually build up the shell. I repeated this process daily for 12 coats, adding a stainless steel wire mesh at the 8th coat for structural stability. Once the shell was complete, we placed it in an autoclave to melt out the wax, hence the lost wax method, then fired it in a kiln. After we checked it for leaks, we set the ceramic shell in a metal container and packed sand around it to keep it from collapsing. Now comes the fun part. Though the melting point of bronze is around 1700 degrees, for this project we needed to raise it to 2200 Fahrenheit to ensure that the metal remained molten until the entire mold was filled. We melted 200 pounds of bronze and poured 180 pounds into the mold. Some bunny. After a few hours of cooling, I could break off the ceramic shell and remove the excess metal that had cooled in the gates that fed the molten metal into the mold. I sandblasted the piece to remove the final bits of shell. I later applied a patina using a series of chemical washes. My bell can now sometimes be heard tolling at midnight on New Year's Eve and on other important occasions. Special thanks to my father for giving me such good hands, and to my good friend Peter Morenstein, whose mentorship and use of his facilities made this project possible.